Hi, my name is Jed Crandall from the University of New Mexico, and I'm going to present this paper, Assessing Post-Deletion in Sine Weibo, Multimodal Classification of Hot Topics. So this is a paper. We have some data from WeiboScope from 2015 to 2018, and we're just trying to understand what's in the data set. So our ultimate goal is to understand what drives the sensors, the sensors that work at Sine Weibo, when they choose which post to censor or not, and to take that like a first principles approach. Like we just summarize the data set and we don't inject any of our own ideas into the process that would bias the results. We haven't achieved that yet. This is very much a work in progress, but I'll talk about what we did do in that vein and what we learned from it. And ultimately what we did do is we created 14 topics, and then we created text and image classifiers for those topics, and with some other variables we did a survival analysis, and it illuminated the path forward for how we're going to do this. So Meisam is the first author, Meisam Navaki. He's the student that did the bulk of the work. He also got some help from Raj Pandey and a couple of students at University of Hong Kong. And then he worked with Qinghua Fu from the Journalism and Media Studies Center at University of Hong Kong, Michael Chance from ICSI Berkeley, and then myself. So let's take a look at this paper. I'm not going to get into a lot of details of the paper. I just hope that I get you interested enough to read it. And like I said, we just want to summarize a censorship data set. And we found that that's very challenging. If you don't want to inject your own ideas, like, I'm going to think up categories, or I'm going to, have some theory and test a theory against that data set. If you just want to take the data set and summarize it and say, this is what makes things censored or not in this data set, it turns out to be very challenging. And what we ended up being able to show with the approach that we ended up taking in this first effort, where we created 14 categories and tested against those 14 categories, was that sentiment was the only consistent indicator of censorship in the data. So I'll talk about that result. And we were ultimately trying to say, well, what makes the censors tick? And like I said, you can make up a set of categories that you think indicate censorship, and that's basically what we do in this paper. But ultimately, our ultimate goal, where we're trying to go with this paper, is reverse engineer what the data says about what leads to censorship or not. And we learned a lot about how we might do this, and I'll talk about that too. So we want to summarize a data set. So our original idea was to take CNN localization, which is you can have a CNN and then you can train it on something, and then if it's the right kind of CNN, you can go back and you can say, well, what about this image makes it belong to a certain category, for example, or be censored. So originally we wanted to take all of the images in WeiboScope, and then eventually all of the text too, and then build a classifier that could decide whether they're censored or not, and then work backwards and see what actually made them censored. What was it in the image or in the text that made something censored versus not? When we actually came to understand our data set, now we understand that that is a lot more challenging. And so as we went through the whole process, I'm going to talk about where we actually tried some hierarchical clustering, and we tried to build a general classifier just for censored versus not. The reasons why we failed became illuminated when we built 14 categories and then just tried to look at those 14 categories, which were all things that we thought were obviously going to be censored all the time. And it turned out that wasn't the case. So the data we're working with is WeiboScope. It's 64,022 censored posts from, 2015 to 2018. And I think I forgot to mention, this is the alternate presentation. So you should be seeing a presentation from Meisam Navaki. If something technically wrong happens, then you'll be seeing this presentation. And my presentation is not as polished as Meisam's because I just threw this together at the last minute just in case there's something wrong with Meisam's video or whatever. So that should say 2015 to 2018. And then we chose, there's millions of uncensored posts during that time period that Wayboscope recorded. And you can read about their methodology in our paper or in theirs, how they choose, which users to follow and everything. But it's a pretty good picture of what's going on in Wayboscope. And of those millions of uncensored posts, we chose 64,022 for a total of 128,044 posts, half of which are censored, half of which are not, so that we have a balanced data set. And what we're going to see after we make our 14 categories, and then we try to take all the censored ones and put them in one of those 14 categories, is by far the largest category is other. Things that didn't fit into our 14 preconceived notions of what should be a censored category. That's going to be the biggest category. So we're going to take a semi-automated approach. First we categorized the censored image, so we literally just had humans go through all of the images and then say, what do we see in here? We see a bunch of protests, we see a bunch of pictures of Deng Xiaoping, and that's how we made the 14 categories. And then the 14 categories were extracted from the images, but we also applied NLP to the text of all the posts, so that for any given post, we can say both in terms of the image and in terms of the text separately, do they fit into one of these 14 categories. And then along with those variables and some other variables like the number of posts, reposts, so the number of retweets, number of comments, and I think one other, we do a survival analysis to see what is the biggest indicator of censorship, like what really makes something get censored. And survival analysis is also looking at how quickly it gets censored. So why are we doing the CNN localization? Don't worry, I'll explain this image in a second. So remember originally we were going to have just, is it censored or not, and then work backwards and use the CNN localization to have the machine learning teach us, what about the image is censored. In the end, we abandoned that so that we could, just take an initial cut with these 14 categories and see what's actually in the data to see why we were failing to build such a classifier. And so what we ultimately ended up using the CNN localization for is just as a diagnostic. If we have a category, so this is Hong Kong protest category. Actually, it's a more specific category than the Hong Kong protest. This is before the recent protests. These are older protests that had happened in Hong Kong. And we have a category called making an X with your arms. And so we're just looking for people making an X with their arms in the image. And we can use CNN localization either for false positives or for true positives. A human can look at it and say, well, what is the machine learning algorithm actually looking at? Is it something fragile, like any crowd of people that thinks they're making an X with their arms and it's highlighting the crowd, or is it actually highlighting their arms to say the CNN is looking for exactly what a human would be looking for to categorize that image? And it helps with false positives too. So like for nudity, if you get a false positive for nudity, and we actually manually pull out our false positives, and the CNN localization, if the CNN is working well, then you just have a few false positives like this where it says, well, this image is nudity, and a human can look at it and say, yeah, that's not nudity. That's not why the censors would have deleted this image, and then manually say, okay, this one is not censored because of that. It doesn't belong to that category. Or another case would be like if you have a CNN categorizing something like flood, and all it's looking for is the border of water and something that's not water, and it's calling it a flood. When clearly a human can look at this and say, that's not a flood, that's just a lake. And so, the CNN acts as a diagnostic, and we can say, okay, the CNN is just broken. It's not doing what we want it to be doing, and we need to fix the category, like change the category, or do something to help the CNN find what we want it to be looking for. And so the CNN localization is really just a diagnostic in that sense. So now let's look at what we found, but to look at what we found in context, I think it's important to understand a couple of concepts out of Blake Miller's dissertation. And so they can be found in a couple of papers, which ended up being a couple of chapters in the dissertation. And so one is this who not what paper. And basically in this paper, the idea that they're pushing, and they make a very convincing argument, is that it's not about what you say online that gets you censored, or particular topics, or even like how much you're getting followed or anything. It's really, are you trying to carve out your own space that's separate from the the space that the people in power in China have for themselves to influence public opinion. If you're trying to carve out your own space, sometimes you'll get censored even if you're not touching on topics that are censored topics. Just the fact that you're carving out your own space and influencing people, becoming a major influencer, can itself lead to censorship. So it's really about who, not what. And another paper that is definitely worth checking out is this, the limits of commercialized censorship in China. And this is actually specific to Sina Weibo, and it's during the same time period that our data was collected by the WeiboScope project. And basically what this paper says is they actually got emails and other information showing what the internal process was to make decisions about censorship at Sina, which is the company that runs the Weibo platform. And so they were actually able to parse through these emails and see what kinds of things were going into their decision. And so the way that censorship works at Sina is that they get government directives from various parts of the government. So it might be Beijing police, Shanghai police, the ministry that handles blogs, or another ministry, one that's specific to journalism, that's part of the communist government. And then they make a decision. They say, well, this is Shanghai police. We don't care what they say, so we're not going to censor this thing. Or they'll get one from the central government saying, censor this thing. But then they'll look at their competitor and they'll say, well, our competitor isn't censoring it, and we don't want to be not competitive. Like we're the ones that censor things and they don't, so we lose customers. So we're just going to make a conscious decision to ignore this directive. And interestingly, anytime they get anything from the Beijing police, then they take it very seriously because they're a Beijing company. So, it's very interesting the way that their internal processes work. And just to keep that in mind, that it's not, what I think a lot of people envision is like the censors are in tune with what the government is thinking all the time, and are just thinking to themselves, like, these are the topics nobody should talk about. Because that's the way we usually think about censorship in the West, but that's not the way that it actually works. So where did we get the variables from that we're going to do this survival analysis on? So there's different theories, coming out of the Zhu et al. Paper from Usenet Security 2013, or other papers that have looked at this. You might think, well, it's about what you post that gets a post censored. So something about the text or the image. I talked about a politician, or I put up an image of a politician, or I put up an image of protests. And then you have, much more, these theories are kind of straw men. There's much more sophisticated theories in the literature, like, out of Gary King's group, there's this idea of collective action potential. But a simpler form of that we can use as straw man is, it's the sentiment. Like, what are you saying about something? And, it's also, how viral it is. Like, if this gets retweeted a lot, then all of those are going to get deleted. But if it doesn't get retweeted a lot, you can say something horrible about Mao or, whoever. And if nobody cares, like, get one retweet or something. And we also look at comments too, then they're not going to bother with it. And this is something that has been shown, is that users that have a lot of followers and posts that have a lot of tweets do tend to get censored. But we're going to take a finer grained look at this with survival analysis. And it's also about whether you have a lot of followers or not. So what we did, like I said, we made up 14 categories based on what we were seeing in the images as we parsed through them manually, just with humans. And we made a 15th category, which is other. Any image that doesn't fit into those just goes into other. And we did the same thing for the 14 categories. We built classifiers for the text. We built classifiers for the images, obviously, and then we built classifiers for the text by extracting keywords that were related to those 14 categories. And this was largely a manual effort, and semi-supervised, and the details are in the paper. Like I mentioned, we use CNN localization as a diagnostic to cull false positives for the images, and then we performed survival analysis. So we looked at take a look in the paper so you can see. Here we're using CNN localization as a diagnostic. And you can see that we took is the image part of one of our 14 categories, is the text part of one of our 14 categories, how many reposts were there, how many comments were there, and how much sentiment was there. How was the sentiment, positive or negative. And you can see there are some categories where the image is statistically significant. Like, if you have an image of Bo Shi Lai, then you're likely to get censored. But interestingly, just within our categories, you can see if either the text or the image mentions Bo Shi Lai, you only have a 64% chance of getting censored, though. There isn't really a category. And some of these are, pretty strong categories, like protests that you would expect to be much closer to 100% censored. So that was one thing that shocked us, was how many posts get left up that are very sensitive posts but just don't get censored. And you can see the only consistent across all categories thing that leads to censorship is sentiment. So we can always see a statistically significant negative correlation with sentiment. So if you're saying something negative about one of these topics, that's when you get censored. And that's really the only consistent thing we saw across all 14 topics. So if we get back to our original motivation here, and that's based on survival analysis. So how long does the post last after somebody posts it? And if we get back to our original motivation, so remember, we're trying to summarize a data set. And we're trying to avoid making up these categories. So what can we do that's better? So what we plan on doing in future work is focusing on identities. So remember, we have this huge other category. If we focus on identities, so instead of some of our categories were already identities, like Bo Shi Lai, Winnie the Pooh, Xi Jinping. And so really what we would like to do is just have a complete set where we know this was extracted from the data. It's not just 14 things we made up. And so there's well understood algorithms to get a complete set of categories if your categories, in quotes, are identities of people. So there's named entity extraction, which is well understood and works, fairly well to give you, and for some sense of the word complete, a complete set. And then there's facial clustering. So we've actually extracted hundreds of identities, and we know that, as confident as we are in these algorithms, at least, we have a complete set of people that are mentioned in censored posts or uncensored posts that, appear at least 10 times. You have to set some kind of threshold, but we have hundreds of people that appear at least 10 times in the WeiboScope data set. And then we can start to ask questions based on those categories. And those categories are something that anybody could come up with the exact same set. Unlike the 14 for this paper, where somebody might think up totally different 14 categories. Another reason we want to focus on identities is we had thought censorship was about topic, but we didn't see a clean signal that really makes that seem to be the case. So we're working with the theory now. Censorship is about people carving out a space of their own. And if censorship is about people, both the people making the post and the people the post are about, become relevant. And so that's another reason to focus on identities. But we are still trying to build, based on what we learned about our data, we're still trying to build that censored versus not censored classifier, and then use CNN localization to know what makes it censored. But that's a work in progress and very challenging. And that's all.